In an older video, I spoke about why the African continent fell, and I introduced a model called the Five Gates Theory. The ideas presented in that theory aren't new. Previous scholars such as Chancellor Williams have spoken about it before in great detail. I think it's important that the diaspora continues developing that framework, or at least emphasize certain points. Today, I would like for us to understand the history of Africa's manpower drain and how it relates to other aspects of Africa's fall. What up, African world? It's Team here, and welcome back to another video of African history, culture, and worldview. By supporting this channel on Patreon, you're helping in the creation of these videos and contributing to this content. On Patreon, you can find more in-depth courses on African history. The link to Patreon is in the description box below. To begin, it's important to stress that these ideas aren't new. It's been years since the groundbreaking work of Chancellor Williams, and I think it'll be useful to discuss any developing frameworks since then. It's not only a good refresher, but it will help anchor us in our African-centered approach to why the African continent fell. One of the purposes of this channel was to truly unpack and understand our history from the best perspective available. That being said, I really want you guys to dissect, analyze, add, or take away from what you hear today, because over time, I will be improving on this idea, borrowing from your input. Keep in mind that everything in this video is my personal interpretation of the historical data and may be subject to change as it develops over time. The concept I'm referring to as manpower drain is in part borrowed from Dr. Claude Anderson. He applied the concept of brain drain to address one of the conditions facing the Black community in America. I simply repurposed the concept to suit the needs of African history, calling it manpower drain. But we'll see how manpower drain and brain drain go hand in hand. As you can imagine, manpower drain deals with the seemingly endless supply of free labor to growing empires around the globe. Personally, I think many people in the African diaspora believe this was the beginning or principal factor as to why the African continent fell. However, from my studies, this was merely the nail in the coffin, so to speak. Manpower drain consolidated the end for many nations across the African continent. It became increasingly more difficult for Africa to compete economically because of manpower drain. It wasn't the beginning of the fall, but a symptom of the fall. Unfortunately, manpower drain from the perspective of Dr. Claude Anderson has regulated Afro-descendant people into a class of producers, but not possessors of wealth. He distills this history quite nicely. Wealth from Black labor was the engine that drove world civilization for nearly 300 years. Beginning in Europe and spreading into the New World, wealth produced by Blacks fueled banking and industrial revolutions, generated new forms of government and economies, transferred massive amounts of wealth across racial, ethnic, and national boundaries, and fomented numerous civil wars. The manpower drain was undergirded by African diversity, as Africans of differing languages and cultures competed against each other for wealth and resources, utilizing the enslavement of their less globalized and therefore vulnerable neighbors for enrichment. The trade of enslaved Africans to European and Arab nations was clearly an unequal exchange. Singular ethnic ambition did not bode well for a heavily diverse continent. Divide and conquer could not have been made easier as Arabs and Europeans exploited a natural disadvantage. Aside from the manpower drain, there's a brain drain as well. For example, the inoculation process was introduced into Boston because of an enslaved African named Onesimus. Onesimus described a process of inoculation common in regions of Africa in which the skin of a healthy person is exposed to a small amount of secretions from the pustule of an infected person. This was incredibly useful against smallpox in Boston, and the information reportedly was the main topic of discussion in medical debates in the colony. This small example is not just evidence of a manpower drain, but also a brain drain. Old African knowledge in STEM, if you will, was readily extracted for the benefit of European nations. Moreover, inventive knowledge from the minds of newly arrived Africans was also available, contributing to the future wealth of nations. Unfortunately, because of African diversity, African innovation and knowledge such as this was usually dispersed, excelling in small pockets and rarely centralized. For example, all of America can now benefit from inoculation, but just a few decentralized ethnic groups in West Africa benefit from the same knowledge. The introduction of rice cultivation by Africans in South Carolina undoubtedly produced massive amounts of wealth for the southern colony. Enslaved Africans would bring this technology across the Atlantic to South Carolina, where their skills and knowledge made possible the colonial prosperity of coastal Carolina in the 18th century. The origins of Manpower drain, however, goes back much further, all the way to about the 7th and 8th centuries AD. African men below the Sahara were being conscripted into Arab and Berber armies. In fact, according to one source, in 711, Tariq of the Umayyads sent his conscripted troops from the Sudan to spearhead the invasion of the Iberian Peninsula. When Tariq crossed the sea, he came out at the mountain named after him and sent forward the Sudan to make war. When the Goths saw these frightful forms, they were terrified. The Sudan used to take Gothic and Christian prisoners and slaughter them. This initial invasion led to others in which more conscripted soldiers from the Sudan participated. With Moorish power in the Iberian Peninsula intact, all of Europe benefited from a different form of wealth, as Moorish occupation initiated the Renaissance in Europe by preserving and translating at much earlier period the great works of the Greeks. They gave a vivifying impulse to all the intellectual life of the West by introducing to it the hoarded knowledge of the East. In mathematics, they imported much from India, amongst other things the numerals known to us as Arabic numerals, and with them the advantages of the decimal system. The Arab-initiated manpower drain was of great intellectual utility for European civilization as a whole because it globalized their knowledge, enhancing their material culture. The Spanish, borrowing the Arab model, also used African manpower to not only build the wealth of the New World, but to conquer the New World, establishing wealth-building colonies. According to Matthew Restall, Black men played a pivotal role in the conquest and pacification of the Americas. Wherever Spaniards set foot in the Americas as members of conquest companies, they were accompanied by black conquistadors. There were thousands of conscripted African men fighting along with the Iberian conquistadors. Entire military units were available to the Spanish, so much so that some scholars have called them the Black Conquistadors. According to some scholars, it's noted how remarkably silent the historical record is regarding the tremendous role played by African men. Now, this is not to say that African states did not use conscripted soldiers. They most certainly did. One of the greatest military rulers in West Africa, Sunni Ali, comes to mind. However, the diversity in language, culture, and religion throughout West and Central Africa made it increasingly more difficult to form long-lasting states that could centralize and benefit from either African or global innovation. Manpower drain is primarily a symptom of Africa's fall and not a cause. That's the key component in understanding this phenomenon. Powerful African states draining the manpower of surrounding African ethnic groups was useful for a time, but African diversity inevitably neutralized that reward. The African manpower drain for Europeans and Arabs, however, was incredibly more impactful because they did not suffer the same degree of natural caveats found in Africa. The manpower drain not only developed the land, but it also aided in conquering it, as mentioned before. Free African labor produced enormous wealth and access to additional global knowledge for Europe, giving them a material and economic advantage that sealed the fate for the next 300 plus years for the African continent and her descendants across the globe. The diaspora was left to deal with this wealth inequity accrued through centuries of manpower drain. Well, I'm all out, guys. I'm hoping you can give some feedback to improve this perspective, as it's important for us to understand our history so that we have a better chance of avoiding these pitfalls. If you like these videos and want to help in its continued development, consider supporting the home team on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. Know thyself, remember your ancestors. Peace.